So basically, I'm a senior project manager, and
Hello, and welcome to season 2 of Conversations with Black Women in Tech. I'm so excited to bring you our first guest of the season. Her name is Ciara. She is the owner of Ciara Jones Consulting LLC. I'm going to bring her on so we can get the conversation started. Hello.
Hello, Khadijah. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm glad to be joining you.
I'm so glad to have you. I met Ciara on TikTok, watching one of her videos, and we speak to women across all different aspects of the tech field. And a lot of our women, our Black women, they face a lot of challenges, just because one, they're Black, and then two, they're a female. In the tech industry, which is normally a male-dominated field. And so I just thought you were so dope with the work that you're doing with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I wanted to kick the season off just talking about that and just get some insights on that. But before we get into the meat and potatoes of everything, I want you to just tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started working in that field.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm excited to talk about Black women, corporate America, inclusion, all the things. As Khadijah mentioned, my name is Ciara Jones. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I actually started getting into like DEI work, inclusion work a long time ago. Even when I was an undergraduate student at UC Berkeley, I was always taking coursework around systems of power and privilege, whether in ethnic studies or African American studies. And then I actually went on to do my graduate degree at Harvard University in theology. And people tend to think that studying religion is this kind of like woo-woo thing of like, but going to theology school is not just about like what biblical text says about living and being. It's actually about how the sociology of religion, how throughout history have Black women defined biblical text, and how has that been different maybe than how white dominant communities have thought about God. And so it was actually through studying theology that I got an even better understanding about how power and privilege works within our broader world. Then I went on to work in higher education for some time as a DEI specialist. I worked in tech for a little bit, and then I went on to launch my own consultancy. So it was about 5 years from graduating college or graduating grad school to launching my own consultancy. And it was that time from grad school to being in the workforce that really helped shape the work that I do now.
So what do you do in your consulting firm? Like, how do you help your clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I run a consulting firm called Ciara Jones Consulting LLC, and there's a variety of ways that I work with clients. One way is actually through surveying and evaluation. So working with organizations to actually say, what are your DEI goals and how can we assess the current state of your organization? So through surveys, through focus groups, and qualitative interviews, actually assess employees' experiences of belonging. I analyze that data, and then I tell organizations, this is your current state and this is where we can go. So sometimes it's large scale assessments, but oftentimes it's through workshops and training. So I come into organizations and they say, we've collected all this data and we notice that these are issues of belonging. Can you design a workshop series to address some of this? And so I work with organizations to create targeted training models to really upskill all of employees that are there. And so that's really my work. And sometimes I'll do strategic planning as well, where maybe I'll work with DEI officers in an organization and I'll say, let's shore up your strategic plan for the next 12 to 16 months. What do you want to accomplish and how can I help you build that roadmap? So I'm in that planning, workshop, and assessment is where I live.
Okay, I love that. So, did you face any challenges, in the workplace or even in college? I always imagine Harvard, even though I see a lot of people, Black
Yeah.
women that are going to Harvard, but I always imagine it just to be a male, white dominated type of school. So, what type of challenges did you face, and how did that shape the work that you're doing today?
I'm already laughing just because, like, oh my gosh, like what a journey being at the institution was. And something I talked about recently on my page was the high profile firing of Harvard President Claudine Gay, and how
Right.
that's emblematic of how racist and vitriolic Harvard can be to Black women, particularly and women of color and people of color. And so I experienced so much at Harvard. I actually left Harvard pretty traumatized, and it's only in with years of distance that I can see all that experience gave me. But when I first left, it was not the best experience. So, I mean, even today I gave a training on allyship, and something I talked about was I was in a class at Harvard for 18 weeks. There was only 2 Black women in this course. For 18 weeks, our professor called us a different name from each other. And it was actually on week like 16 that we actually just walked out of class because it was just getting so frustrating never being called our own names. I was in a class my first semester called Ministry Studies. And for this course, we had to create our own community like health project, like through the lens of ministry. I said my project was to actually work with LGBTQ communities on religious trauma. And so that was kind of an example of some of the projects. And so one woman in our class said she wanted to do work with white evangelical communities around allyship and anti-racism and solidarity, which is work that we need. I want to highlight that for your podcast. But she came into class and she said, I know that I'm a great white ally because I used to think when I saw a Black person, like they would steal something. But now that I'm at Harvard and I'm around educated Black people, I know that educated Black people aren't violent. And like something like that in my class, like something really wild. And we like had to, and like my professor didn't say anything. No one else said anything except a few Black people in class. We stood up and we said, the fact that you only can humanize Black people when they're in a certain echelon or class status says that you have so much work to do around unlearning. And so I also think at Harvard, we see this perpetuation of Black excellence, this idea that Black folks only with a certain education status or class status are deserving of humanization. That comes into the classroom. Reading syllabi that still say things like Oriental, like why are we reading authors that are using this type of language, right? So all of this stuff.
I haven't heard that in a very long time.
Yeah, and we're reading that like this is canonical religious scholarship. So I think, so much work just so much that came up in the classroom. And the last thing I'll highlight is I had so many amazing Black women professors and advisors. And something I just felt like during my time in academia was seeing how they were doing so much beautiful work, but I also just saw how fatigued they were and how the institution wasn't giving them the support and resources they needed for all the outpouring they were doing. So just so many different things. And lastly, I'll highlight during that time, I actually wrote a few articles about this. I wrote an article called Grad School is Trash for Students of Color. I wrote an article called Not Just the Scholarship, or Not Just the Discipline, Throw the Whole, or Not Just the Syllabus, Throw the Whole Discipline in the Trash. I wrote another one called the Whisper Campaign of Academic Trauma, about how Black people don't want to name how much academia is traumatizing them because they want to preserve their own space in academia without realizing it's slowly eroding their well-being. So much to think about and talk about.
So I guess my next question is, if you could, what kind of things do you think you would put in place to kind of change the narrative? I know you spoke about changing the narrative when I was reading that point. Like, what kind of things do you think you could do to change the narrative at Harvard, for example?
Ooh, and higher education. I thought you were going to say in corporate America. Higher ed is a big one.
I was, but now I'm intrigued.
It's true. So I actually used to work as a diversity specialist at Berkeley, as I mentioned before, I launched my own consultancy. So I do have a lot of thoughts on higher education. And there's a few like low or easier lifts that we could do in higher ed to help some of this. So I'm going to focus on the easier lifts versus the big structural stuff. But a few things. I think every area within higher ed, every discipline should be doing a comprehensive curriculum review. You should be looking at all of your syllabi. What scholars are you amplifying and what voices are you erasing? A big part of creating equity in scholarship is first making sure that we're actually creating syllabi that focus on Black women voices, LGBTQ voices, disability voices. Because if we aren't doing that, our scholarship is biased. And we forget that has real implications. If, for example, if you are a white man that's going to med school, you're only reading other white men's scholarship around biomedical research, then you're going into these hospital rooms and you're thinking things like Black people have higher pain tolerance, Black people have thicker skin, because nothing in your scholarship challenged your own biased and racist conceptions. So one, it's starting with really looking at what is a curriculum we are teaching in the classroom. That's number one. Number two, we need to look at the workload distribution for women of color faculty and for faculty of color, period. Because the way that higher ed is eroding their well-being is something that I cannot even, I think, fully articulate well. Something I talked about in my video when I discussed the ousting of Dr. Gay was how just recently we unfortunately saw a very high-profile suicide of a Black woman who works in higher ed at the VP of Liberty University. Was that the Lincoln University. Liberty is a very conservative university. Lincoln University, Missouri. We saw the high-profile passing of Joanne A. Epps, Dr. Epps was also a president of a college university, and Arinthia Montag, who was also a Black woman college president of the university. They had two untimely deaths in September, and many speculated that this was related to the weathering of higher ed. So I also think it's about looking at pay equity for faculty, workload distribution. All of that is part of this. And the last thing I will say is, higher ed has to get out of this idea of like meritocracy, this idea that we just come in and we're successful based on our own brilliance and we fail based on our own weakness. We need to get honest that there are so many systems working against students of color, whether that's what they're experiencing systemic oppression outside, whether that's micro and macro aggressions in the classroom. I think we need to get a little bit more real about how insidious and toxic the environment can be. But I do like to highlight that at its best, higher ed is a place of liberation. Like I was able to love and accept myself as a queer woman because of what I learned in the classroom. And so that's why I'm passionate about this work in higher ed, because it can be a beautiful place if we put in the work to transform it, I think.
And I think that translates into corporate America, because if you're coming from, we won't keep messing with Harvard, but you're coming from, university or college, and you go into the workspace and you are a white male, like you said, you already have the biases that you went into school with. But if the school is reinforcing those, when you get into the workplace, you have those same biases. And, it's hard for us coming in as Black women in tech, trying to work in those environments, dealing with that after going to college for 4 years and then graduate school, and now you're in the workplace. I could understand the pressure that a lot of those women feel. Like I said, the show initially was just to highlight what Black women are doing in the tech space, but it really turned into them really sharing some horror stories. And I think it's so unfortunate, because we want more Black women in tech. We need more Black women in the tech space.
Yeah.
But I can recall when I graduated high school, I got a scholarship to Drexel for architectural engineering.
Whoa, that's amazing.
Well, that was 100 years ago.
Okay.
I'm old. But I remember being in the classroom, and it was me and one other Black woman. And every time it came time to take notes for a group project or something like that, we always had to be the secretaries. Every analogy that the professor used was based around sports, and it was just a very unwelcoming vibe. It just almost felt like you didn't want us to be there. So, and we're talking about what, 26 years ago?
Yeah.
And I'm still finding the same things. It's just really unfortunate.
Can I respond to that really quickly? Just because what you said, I literally wrote an article for my newsletter a couple weeks ago called "I Feel Like the Help at Work," because I had just talked to one of my best friends, who's a Black woman in tech, and she said, "Sarah, I'm being given all these minuscule, weird side tasks." She's like, "I'm a program coordinator, but people are treating me like I'm their personal assistant." So, like you said, these same themes are coming up over and over. And a lot of these themes, I feel like, like we don't talk about how much they're based in slavery too, about whose servitude we expect in the work environment, about what tasks people take on. That's rooted deeply in the process of, the chattel slavery and Black codes and Jim Crow. That we still see that all, in our present day.
What kind of work did you do in the tech field? You said you worked in the tech space for a little bit. What kind of work did you do?
Yes, I worked I worked in fintech. So I worked as a finance journalist and doing content management, like SEO, search engine optimization stuff in tech. And that honestly, I mean, the amount of bias I experienced in that job was why I started my own consulting firm. Actually, like I just felt like I'm not sure if corporate America is a place where I can thrive or survive. That was how I was feeling at the time that I started this work. And I think I experienced a lot of the things that Black women, I'll just kind of talk about my overarching experience. And then I'm curious, Khadijah, if this is a through line with your other guests. But for me, it came up in a few ways, like the racism I experienced. One, if you work in journalism, like if you're a writer, then you always have an editor, and that editor is your manager, right? And where I worked, you kind of had a team of editors and a team of writers. So, for example, I wrote for the insurance vertical. So I was one of like maybe 3 writers on that team, and that team had maybe 4 editors, and then one an editor that oversaw all of us. So something that would happen often on the team is I would get passed to different editors, and all these editors would give me different feedback about my writing and how to change it. So then if I went to a different editor, then they would edit out the same things I was being coached to do by the other editor. And I was this round robin where it was like this, something I say a lot is performance becomes a moving goalpost for Black women, where you're actually doing the exact thing that they're saying around your feedback, and then you're still being told you're wrong. And it becomes very confusing. And so about 6 months into that role, I said, you are giving me so much feedback, and my job is to synthesize and give you what you need, but I'm actually having no support around what you actually want from me. And this is not a fair process. It's becoming dehumanizing, and I need a better coaching environment. So I think that's something I see with women, other Black women too, is like this confusion about expectations. Then 2, in September of that job, I had my yearly performance review. My year was coming up in November, but I had my annual performance review in September, basically. And in September, I was told I wouldn't get promoted till September of 2022. I was told I wouldn't get promoted until January of 2024, based on my first year performance review. But what's fascinating is, Khadijah, when I quit this job, the first thing like the CEO said to me was like, or one of the managing directors said is, why are you quitting? You're slotted for promotion. Okay. So I have been told I was not going to get promoted. And as I'm quitting, you're telling me, why are you quitting? You're like one of our top writers. And that was never feedback I was ever given. It was very belittling feedback. It was suggested in that job that I was plagiarizing my own writing. So, I mean, so many different things that came up that made me say, like, I don't feel like I'm set up for success here or to thrive here. It almost felt like I was being undermined as I was trying to do everything I needed to do. And that experience was just so fatiguing. So I'll pause there because I'm curious to see if that resonates, with some of your other guests too.
A lot of our other guests, they basically just shared something similar, just about workload as it pertains to workload. The type of work that they would get compared to others, the amount of work that they would get compared to others, and promotions. And I think that is really dope that you started your own firm based off of your experience. I wasn't able to do that, but that's kind of what I came away with when I left Drexel. I kind of was like, I want to have an engineering firm, all Black women, so we won't have those problems.
Yeah.
And it's almost like you have to start your own and hire your own in order to, I mean, that's initially what I thought. But after talking to you and seeing the work that you're doing, maybe you can make a difference with, in the workplace with the work that you're doing. You know what I mean? Like, that's what you're doing. But at one point, and honestly, prior to this conversation, I kind of was still of the thought of, listen, we need our own. We need to have our own. I kind of still feel that way, but I feel like for those women who are in those positions, who need their jobs, they're trying to feed their families, we have, a consultant firm like yours come in and train and teach, I think that would be beneficial. So I appreciate the work that you're doing.
I appreciate that. And yeah.
And I love that you're talking about it on TikTok, because I don't, and TikTok is about what you watch. So I won't say that it's not a lot of it on there. Just haven't found it yet. A lot of the TikToks I'm seeing are about, hey, make $10,000 a month selling.
Oh my gosh. No, TikTok always does that. And like, I hate that content. I hate that content because it's like, I feel like it's always a scam. But I also think, and I agree with you. I think it's two things. So one, it's interesting because around the time I started my business, Forbes or Business Insider released an article saying Black women are leaving corporate and higher ed in droves to start their own firms because the environments are untenable. And something I think about that is two things. Like, one, I love that we're starting our own things. And as an entrepreneur, I also recognize the ways that this can be deeply unsustainable. Like, if you have family, I'm not married and I have children, right? So that already lets me have a lot more flexibility about the financial risks I can take. And I also tried to take time while I was at my job to I went with a lot of financial planners before I leaped to say, like, is this possible? Here's my current client flow. What do you think? And so I just know how scary. I just want to acknowledge that entrepreneurship isn't always a good fit for everyone, but it is a beautiful option. And I've been surprised at all the ways. I feel like I'm a spiritual person. So I've been surprised at all the ways the universe has met me at this endeavor too, because it has felt like that. Like, there's been these really beautiful, magical moments in doing this. And I want to say, for Black women that are navigating all of these things, I know that entrepreneurship is not always the way out. And so one thing I really want for ourselves is for us to think really about setting our own metrics for affirmation and success and well-being in these spaces, because the reality is sometimes we're not getting it from our managers and we're not getting it from our colleagues. And I worry that Black women leave work with this really warped perception of themselves, this negative perception of their own intelligence, because they're in environments that can't quite see them. And so I also hope for my work for Black women that stay in corporate, that I'm able to give them some of the skills to have some resiliency around seeing themselves generously, even in an environment that's giving them so many ways to giving them almost a mangled image of themselves, because that's what bias does. It warps us. So I just want to highlight that as well, like that well-being perception for part of my work.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, entrepreneurship is not for everybody. But I think, for the women who do take that leap, it's important to make sure you're hiring people that look like you, and making sure that environment, because honestly, up until probably a few years ago, any manager, Black manager that I worked under, female manager, was sometimes worse than some of the white managers, if we're being honest. If we're going
Yeah.
to be honest here, they're harder to work for sometimes too. And I know a lot of times it's because maybe they're trying to, you know, teach you some things, mentor you in a way, but a lot of times it's just because that's just the way they are. They feel like they earned their spot, and they're probably getting a lot of backlash from their white counterparts on the back end, and they take it out on you. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I just want to make sure that if you do start a business, that you are hiring people that look like you, and making sure that their work environment um, it's not like what they're running away from, basically, that they're not there and they hate it more than when they, were working in corporate America.
Yeah.
Um,
Can I respond to that? Because that's brilliant.
yeah,
Yeah, no, I love one. Like, I need to talk about this more because that's one of the number one comments I get is like, you're talking about bias across lines of identity. It's another Black woman that is harming me in the work environment. And I think sometimes we have to remember, I think as Black women, that like trauma is not a teaching tool. I think sometimes like we say, like, I was traumatized in this environment, so I'll traumatize you. So that it's like almost this trauma hazing. Like you need to know how to survive here. You know, we need to be twice as good to get half as much. And like, I'm going to teach you that. When it's actually the thing we need from each other is gentleness and mutual sight. I think in the work environment for one another, we really should be that one soft landing place to say, like, these systems are not for us and might not always see us, but I see you. And I'm really grateful because in my job at tech, there was a Black woman that pulled me out of the trenches to affirm me every day because she knew
yeah,
what I was going through. But also in higher ed, I'll never forget this. One of my first professors in graduate school, she kept grading me down so low on like 100 word, like just like discussion posts. And I was like, what the heck? And then like, she was like, I went to her office hours and I said, like, why am I getting this like low marks on this very simple project? And she was like, I didn't like your word choice here. I hated your period here. Like, you can't be in an Ivy League institution and be sloppy. And like, you can't be like this. And I remember calling my sister like sobbing because I think sometimes we forget how much we just want to be seen by each other, especially as a young Black woman. I have a lot of reverence for older Black women. I want them to
right,
see me. I want their wisdom. I see them as my aunties and my
right,
grandmas and my moms, you know? And so just, I think we have to remember too, as Black women, like we can be this beautiful side of care for each other, but we can also really tear one another down in these spaces. And it can sit with that experience will always sit with me. How I felt leaving her classroom, I'll
right.
always remember that experience, you know? So yeah, we have to really be mindful.
And we have unconscious bias too. It's not just, your white counterparts, or just other races. Like, we have our own unconscious bias based off of probably the experiences that we've had. So
Yes.
you heard what's her name, Dr. Heavenly. She was talking about Black women complain the most. She's a prenatal
I
OBGYN.
saw that was so disappointing. That
But
was
I,
so
but I
disappointing.
feel like, not I'm not trying to justify what she said or
Mhm.
even try to condone what she said, but I feel like it's the same. She's coming from the same place that the other doctors are coming from.
I understand
She
what you're saying.
she has the same unconscious bias, and she probably didn't even realize it till she said it out her mouth, till she said it out loud, and
Mhm.
people started coming for her. It's like, you think that way, just like they think that way, because you went through the same university, you went through the same training, you went through the same medical training that they did. So
Mm,
instead of you looking at the lens like, well, I'm a Black woman and I know that I feel pain just like anybody else, you went through the same training, and now you have this unconscious bias. And I really think that it wasn't until she said it out her mouth that it was like, oh wow, you know what
yeah.
I mean? I really hope that for her, she took that, took a minute, took a beat, and said, wow, is that how I
Mm,
really feel, or is that just what I've been taught? Is that something that I didn't even really think about prior to me saying it? I just hope, like, I'm all for my people, so I don't ever want to just throw her out and cancel her. But it's like, all
yeah.
doctors feel that way. I think they all feel that way to a certain degree.
No, absolutely. I think that's why I highlighted like, you know, the importance of literally I think higher ed's first start is diversifying scholarship because what is being taught, you're right, even for Black doctors, they're having their own like biases or their own anti-Blackness that's being
Hmm.
probably affirmed by what they're studying within the academy.
Right.
And it is interesting. I think it's funny because I got asked one time by a white person on TikTok about like allyship and like anti-racism and like how difficult this work is. And I said, I think you forget that Black people are doing their own work around unlearning anti-Blackness. Women are doing their own work about unlearning sexism. As a queer person, I had to do so much work about unlearning internalized homophobia. So I just appreciate you highlighting like
Mhm.
even for all of us who carry marginalized identity, this is our work too, to figure out how we're perpetuating bias. And I think also for Black folks in the academy, like something my brother and I talk about a lot in higher ed, there is clear colorism and who is getting tenure, whose research is getting published. It is very clear the way that dark-skinned Black folks get maligned in the academy. Sizeism in the academy is very clear as well. Ableism for Black folks. So I think also the way that I see these dynamics play out within the Black community is really interesting as well, like around Black academics.
And we could talk about colorism for another hour.
Oh yeah, we could absolutely. And colorism, especially colorism, like I think something I see with my dark skinned women colleagues is like colorism and personality feedback. And like whose bodies we read as angry and hostile, like all that comes into the conversation, around Black women in work, and we have to unpack that more.
Yes, we definitely do. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I'm definitely going to have you back on the show. I have so many more points I want to just hit on. But it was just a pleasure having you on the show. How can people find you if they want to reach out to you?
Yes. Well, I just want to big up and affirm Khadijah and give her flowers just for the work you're doing. I'm grateful to be here and for the amazing conversation. You've given me so much to think about as well. So I'm going to be reflecting after our conversation. And folks can find me in a few places. If you want to learn about me and my services, you can find me at ciarajonesconsulting.com. And there you can also subscribe to my DEI newsletter. And you can also find me on TikTok and Instagram at The Gardening Theologian, where I talk about DEI, religious deconstruction, and our collective well-being. So you can check me out there, and feel free to send me a message. Khadijah sent me a message, and now we're here in a podcast together. So I hope to be able to connect with some of you all out there. And thanks again for tuning in.
Thank you so much.